I never thought I'd cross that line, but it happened. Right here, right now. One forbidden touch, one dangerous choice, and everything changed. You won't believe what I did next. I had always thought college would be just about lectures, assignments, and the occasional party, but somehow it felt emptier than I imagined. I spent most of my days helping Professor Rajan with his research, sitting quietly in his cluttered office while he scribbled formulas across a whiteboard I barely understood. I liked the work. It made me feel useful, but it wasn't exciting. At least it hadn't been until she appeared. I first saw her during one of my errands for Professor Rajan. I had been tasked with delivering some papers to the seminar hall, and there she was, standing near the projector screen, brushing her hair back from her face as she spoke softly to a colleague. The sunlight caught the gold in her hair just right, and her eyes, dark, intelligent, and impossibly kind, glimmered with something I couldn't name. My hands froze around the stack of papers, and for a second, I felt like I'd stumbled into a different world. "Can I help you with that?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She turned to me, and for a heartbeat it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. "Oh, thank you," she said, her voice smooth but warm, like velvet brushing against my skin. "I'm sure I could manage, but it's sweet of you to offer." She smiled, a small knowing smile, and my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with fear. From that moment, I found excuses to see her more often. Sometimes it was in the hallway when she passed by, and sometimes it was when I stayed a little longer to organize the professor's papers. She asked about my classes, teased me gently about my messy handwriting, and laughed at my jokes in a way that made me feel lighter, less like a student drowning in formulas. One afternoon, she stopped by Professor Rajan's office while I was helping him arrange some lab equipment. She leaned casually against the doorway, watching me carefully as I struggled to balance a pile of books. "You're awfully serious for someone your age," she said, raising an eyebrow. I like being organized," I stammered, my face heating up. "Is that so?" she teased, stepping closer. I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something floral but not overpowering, and it made my head spin. "I bet you're very precise in everything you do, aren't you?" I nodded, unable to look away from her eyes. "I try to be." Her lips curved into a knowing smile, just enough to make my heart skip a beat. "I can see that," she whispered, tilting her head as if she could read everything I was thinking. And maybe she could. There was something in her gaze that unsettled me and intrigued me all at once, something that made me feel exposed even though we had barely spoken before. It wasn't long before these encounters became more frequent. Sometimes she would ask me to fetch coffee for the professor, other times she would accidentally brush past me in the hallway, and every time a shiver ran down my spine. She never crossed any lines, at least not overtly, but the way she lingered, the subtle brush of her hand against mine when handing me papers, the way her eyes followed me just a little too long, it was enough. Enough to make me feel a dangerous thrill I didn't quite understand. One day, she asked me to help her with some slides for a presentation. It was in a small, empty classroom, the sunlight streaming in through the blinds. I could feel my pulse racing as I set up the projector, aware that she was standing close behind me. "You're very patient," she said softly, leaning slightly over my shoulder to point at a slide. Her hand brushed mine, and I flinched, but she didn't pull away. "I like that about you," she added, almost as if it were a confession. I swallowed hard, my mind buzzing with conflicting thoughts. This was just innocent, right? Helping the professor. There was nothing wrong with it. And yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were standing on the edge of something much more intoxicating, something forbidden. When she finally pulled back and smiled, she said, "Thank you for your help today. I appreciate it." There was a softness in her tone that made me ache with longing, and I realized, with a jolt, that I wanted more. Not just her gratitude, not just her attention, but her. I left the classroom with my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just a fleeting spark. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. I kept replaying the way her hand had brushed mine, the tilt of her head, the quiet intimacy in her voice. My thoughts swirled with possibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to admit. By the time I returned to the lab, I was shaking with anticipation and confusion. The professor was engrossed in his work, oblivious to the small, dangerous world forming just beyond his notice, and I couldn't help but think with a mix of thrill and fear that maybe this, whatever it was just the beginning. The days after that first private classroom encounter were impossible to focus. Every time I saw her in the hall or even caught a glimpse of her from across the lab, my chest would tighten and my mind would betray me, spinning out of control with thoughts I wasn't supposed to have. I told myself it was harmless. Just attention from a woman I admired, someone who had charm, elegance, and a presence that made every other part of my life feel dull in comparison. But harmless or not, it consumed me. Helping Professor Rajan had always been routine, predictable, but now every task felt charged with the possibility of seeing her, of feeling that small spark that had set my nerves alight. Sometimes she would appear unexpectedly, standing in the doorway with that same quiet smile, and I would stumble over my words like a foolish first-year student. One afternoon she caught me adjusting the projector for a lab demo. "You're awfully meticulous," she said, tilting her head as she leaned slightly against the table. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes across her face, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the subtle flush in her skin. My fingers froze on the projector switch. I like things to be in order," I muttered, suddenly aware of how little sense I was making. She laughed softly, a musical sound that wrapped around me and lingered. "I can see that. And I like it." Very much. Her gaze lingered a fraction too long, and my pulse jumped in response. It wasn't inappropriate, not yet, but the thrill of it was dangerous. As we worked side by side, she would sometimes brush her hand against mine while pointing at slides or lifting a document. I flinched every time, but she never pulled away immediately, letting the contact linger just long enough to make my head spin. It was electric, suffocating, and I hated that I wanted it. "You seem tense," she said at one point, studying me closely. Her eyes were soft, curious, almost probing. "Are you worried about something?" No, not really," I lied, though my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. She smiled, not with amusement but with understanding, and it made me feel exposed. "It's nice to see someone so dedicated," she said, quietly. "Most people don't notice the details, the little things that matter." Her words sent a shiver through me. I wanted to tell her I noticed her too, the way she moved, the way she smiled at small things, the way she lingered near me just a bit too long. But that would be reckless, dangerous. Still, the thought lingered, impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, our interactions grew more frequent, though always under the guise of study sessions or helping the professor. Sometimes she would catch me arranging papers or cleaning the lab and come over, commenting lightly on my work. "You're thorough," she said one day, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she bent over to examine a document. Her hand barely touched mine, but the spark was undeniable. "You make it look easy," she added, her voice lower this time, almost intimate. I felt my face burn. I try," I muttered, fumbling to sound calm while my heart raced. Her eyes softened, and she gave me that small, knowing smile again. "I like that about you," she whispered. It wasn't a compliment in the casual sense, it was something deeper, something that made me want to lean in, closer, even though I knew I shouldn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little interaction replayed in my mind. The brush of her hand, the tilt of her head, the softness in her voice. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, a line I wasn't ready to admit I wanted to cross. The guilt clawed at me, whispering warnings about boundaries and morality, but the thrill of her attention, of being noticed by her, was intoxicating. The next day, she approached me in the lab again, this time with a stack of papers she claimed needed organizing before the professor returned. "Would you mind helping me?" she asked, smiling in a way that made my stomach lurch. "It'll be easier with 2 people." I nodded, my fingers trembling slightly as I took the papers. We worked side by side, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body near mine. Every movement, every brush of her hand against mine sent a jolt of electricity through me. I tried to focus on the task, on the papers, on anything other than the impossible tension building between us, but I failed, utterly. She glanced at me, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said softly, leaning slightly closer, "you're different from the others. Most people don't notice the little things. I like that. I really do." I swallowed hard, words failing me. She looked at me as though she could see everything, the longing, the confusion, the dangerous curiosity I couldn't hide. My heart pounded, my mind racing. Something was shifting between us, and I felt it with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying. As I left the lab later, the papers in my bag and my mind spinning, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just harmless attention, no longer just friendly teasing. Something had begun, something dangerous, something I wasn't ready to name, but I knew, with a jolt of both fear and excitement, that I was drawn to it, drawn to her. I never thought that a simple study session could feel so alive, so full of possibility, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The week after our last encounter passed in a blur. Every time I thought I had pulled myself together, she appeared somewhere in my routine, and the calm I had tried to maintain collapsed in an instant. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that it was just playful attention, but the heat in my chest said otherwise. One afternoon I was in the library, helping her sort through stacks of reference books for a seminar she was presenting. She leaned close to read the spine of a particularly thick volume, and I felt her shoulder brush mine. I froze, acutely aware of the small electricity that ran through my arm. She gave me a faint, almost imperceptible smile, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. "You're always so careful," she said softly, her voice brushing against my ear as she straightened. "It's charming." I swallowed hard, looking anywhere but her eyes. I guess I am," I muttered, suddenly self-conscious. My heart was racing in a way I didn't think was normal. She laughed quietly, that musical sound that had become both a comfort and a torment. "You're cute when you get flustered," she whispered. Her words hit me like a jolt. Cute, flustered, dangerous. Every part of me wanted to lean closer, to test the unspoken line between us, but I forced myself to stay still, to act casual. We continued working, stacking books, labeling notes, pretending nothing unusual was happening, but the air between us was taut, every brush of her hand on mine magnified, every glance loaded with intent. I tried to focus on the work, but my mind kept replaying that brief moment when her shoulder had touched mine, the subtle curve of her lips as she smiled at me, the soft warmth of her body lingering near mine. Later, as we were reorganizing papers on the library table, her hand grazed mine again. This time it lingered longer, long enough that I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked at her quickly, but she was already focused on the notes, pretending nothing had happened. My fingers tingled, and I fought the urge to reach for her hand, to close that small distance that seemed to hum with tension. "You're very precise," she murmured, leaning over the table to point at a misplaced reference. Her hair brushed against my cheek, and I almost forgot to breathe. "I like that. I notice it." I cleared my throat, trying to sound normal. "I appreciate that," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. My body betrayed me in ways I couldn't control. My pulse quickened, my palms grew clammy, and every rational thought screamed at me to stop thinking about her this way, and yet I couldn't stop. She glanced at me again, her eyes soft but knowing, and I felt like she was daring me to cross some invisible line. A thrill ran through me that was part excitement, part fear. I tried to focus on the papers, on the labels, on anything else, but my attention kept snapping back to her, to the way her fingers had brushed mine, to the way she smiled when she thought I wasn't looking. At one point, I reached for a folder, and our hands collided. I jerked back instinctively, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she let her fingers brush against mine just long enough for the tension to deepen, and then she pulled back, smiling faintly. "You're careful," she said, again, almost teasingly. "But I think you like it when I get close." I choked on my words, heat rising to my face. I stammered, trying to regain composure. She tilted her head, that small, infuriating smile on her lips. "Don't lie to me. I can see it in your eyes." My chest tightened. She could see it. She could see the desire I hadn't admitted to myself yet. It was maddening, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. I wanted to touch her again, to test the invisible line, to see if she would pull away or let me cross it. We finished the work in silence, each of us pretending to focus on the library table, but the unspoken tension was electric. When it was finally time to leave, she gathered her papers and glanced at me with that same soft, knowing look. "Thank you for your help," she said quietly, her voice low and intimate. "I enjoy our little sessions." I nodded, my throat dry, and forced myself to speak normally. "Of course." Any time as I walked back to my dorm that evening, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. Every brush of her hand, every lingering glance, every soft word felt magnified, heavier than it should have been. My thoughts were a chaotic mix of guilt and desire, fear and longing, all spinning together in a dizzying swirl. I knew we were dancing dangerously close to something I wasn't supposed to feel, something I wasn't supposed to want. And yet, I couldn't help it. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the thrill of being near her, about the electricity that sparked every time our hands touched. For the first time, I realized that the line between innocent flirtation and something far more forbidden was thinner than I ever imagined. And I had a sinking, thrilling feeling that it was only a matter of time before that line disappeared entirely. I never thought a simple study session could feel like this, like walking on the edge of something wild, something forbidden, something I both craved and feared. And I knew, with a shiver I couldn't ignore, that whatever was coming next would change everything. The lab was empty, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as I set up the last of the slides for the presentation. I had been here before, alone with her, but today felt different, charged with a quiet tension that made my chest pound and my palms sweat. She leaned against the edge of the table, her arms crossed loosely, watching me as I worked. "You always focus so hard," she said softly, her voice low, like she was sharing a secret meant only for me. I like to do things properly," I muttered, trying not to meet her gaze. But I couldn't look away. The light caught her hair just so, highlighting the curve of her neck and the softness of her cheek. She was impossibly close, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her, seeping into my skin. Her smile was small, knowing. "I've noticed," she said, stepping a little closer. My heart leapt. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, where neither of us moved, and the air between us thickened. I wanted to speak, to tell her I had been thinking about her constantly, about every brush of her hand, every fleeting look, but the words stuck in my throat. Then, almost imperceptibly, her hand brushed mine as she reached for a paper. I froze, my chest tightening. The contact was light, casual, or so she made it seem, but it sent a shiver through me that made my head spin. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers linger, grazing mine, letting the tension stretch taut as a drawn string. "You feel that too, don't you?" she whispered, leaning closer. The scent of her perfume, something soft, floral, intoxicating, wrapped around me. My mind was a mess of fear and desire. I knew this was wrong. I knew it was dangerous. And yet I couldn't move, couldn't resist. I stammered, words failing me. My voice sounded small, weak even to my own ears. Her hand moved slightly, tracing the back of mine, slow, deliberate. "Shh. It's okay," she murmured, her lips dangerously close to my ear. My breath hitched. "No one is here but us." Something inside me gave way, a part of me that had been waiting, aching for her attention, for this forbidden closeness. My hand instinctively sought hers, our fingers intertwining like they belonged together. She didn't pull away. She let me hold her hand, let me feel the weight of her warmth, the slight tremble of her touch. She leaned even closer, her body brushing against mine. I could feel the heat of her, the faint rhythm of her heartbeat matching mine. My mind raced, warning me of boundaries, of consequences, but my body betrayed me, craving this connection, this danger, this intimacy that should have been impossible. "I've wanted this," she whispered, and I felt it reverberate through me like electricity. "You've made it impossible to ignore." I swallowed hard, voice shaking. I feel the same." The next moments were a blur of sensation. Her hand slipped from mine to my shoulder, her touch feather-light yet incendiary. My own hands hovered near her waist, trembling with anticipation. Every brush of skin, every shared breath sent jolts of adrenaline through me. There was no rushing, only the careful, measured exploration of proximity, of closeness, of what we both wanted but couldn't fully admit. Her lips brushed against my jaw, soft, teasing, and my knees threatened to buckle. I caught myself on the edge of the table, heart pounding like a drum. "We shouldn't," I whispered, but she shook her head gently, pressing a hand against my chest. "Not here. Not anyone seeing," she murmured, voice low, intimate. "But yes, I want this." The tension didn't break with a single action. It stretched, a delicious, forbidden thread we both tugged at. My mind was screaming, warning me of the danger, of the professor, of every line we were crossing. And yet I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. Every brush of her hand, every glance, every whisper pulled me deeper, made my pulse race faster, made the risk feel like part of the thrill. By the time we finally drew back, breathless. The world outside the lab felt distant and unreal. We were both aware of what had happened, of the unspoken agreement that this was only the beginning, that something dangerous and addictive had been ignited. We can't get caught, I murmured, my voice tight, still reeling. She smiled, that same knowing smile that had haunted my thoughts for days. We won't, she said. We'll be careful. But we both know we want this, don't we? I nodded, words failing me again. My chest was still pounding, my mind spinning with excitement and guilt, fear and exhilaration. The line we had crossed was no longer a possibility, it was reality, and I knew, with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified me, that we were only getting started. As I left the lab that night, the corridor silent around me, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she had pressed close, about the warmth of her hand in mine, about the thrill of crossing that forbidden line. And I knew, in a way I hadn't before, that this was no longer just a fleeting moment. It was something we would continue, secretly, whenever the professor wasn't home. I never thought a simple study session could feel so alive, so dangerous, so utterly consuming, and I knew, with a shiver that traveled from my chest to my fingertips, that this was only the beginning. After that first night, everything changed. Every encounter with her became a careful dance of secrecy, desire, and unspoken rules. We met in the quiet of empty classrooms behind closed doors of the apartment she sometimes rented, and even in the library long after everyone else had gone. Each meeting carried the same mixture of thrill and fear, a stolen touch, a whispered word, a glance that lingered far too long, each one sending jolts through me I could never resist. I became acutely aware of the timing of the professor's comings and goings. Every knock at the lab door, every sudden appearance in the hallway made my stomach twist with panic. Yet the danger only made the moments with her feel more electric, more urgent. I learned to read the subtle signals, the slight hesitation in her walk, the quiet click of her keys that meant it was safe for us to be alone. And every time we were, it was like stepping into a private, dangerous world that belonged only to us. She would tease me relentlessly, brushing against my arm as we rearranged papers or leaning close to whisper instructions, and I would flinch, both nervous and exhilarated. "You're tense again," she would murmur, her lips dangerously near my ear. "Do you like it, though?" I don't know," I'd reply, voice tight with a mixture of guilt and longing. And she would smile, that knowing, infuriating smile that made my mind go blank. My thoughts scattered like autumn leaves in the wind. Sometimes, after we had finished, we would linger, not speaking, just feeling each other's presence in silence. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth radiating from her, it all became addictive. I caught myself imagining what it would be like if there were no boundaries, if no one would judge us, if the professor didn't exist at all. The thought made my chest ache and my mind spin in ways I never expected. The more we met, the more I realized how carefully we had to navigate our secret. Every text, every glance, every excuse had to be perfect. The professor remained oblivious, buried in his research, and that fact made me feel guilty beyond words. But the moments we stole, however brief, were worth the risk. We became experts in timing, in small gestures, in passing touches that no one else would notice. It was a dangerous rhythm, a delicate balance between pleasure and peril, and I couldn't help being drawn deeper into it. I started noticing the subtle shifts in my own behavior. My friends commented on my distracted expression, my avoidance of certain classes, and my sudden preoccupation with vague errands that always seemed to coincide with her schedule. I lied easily, fluently, effortlessly, and yet, with every lie, the thrill of our secrecy grew, as if the act of hiding itself heightened the connection between us. She began to confide in me in ways she hadn't before. Quiet complaints about the professor's absences, his inattentiveness, the loneliness that crept in behind the polished smiles. I listened, offering comfort, feigning empathy, but secretly, I reveled in the intimacy that came from being the one she trusted. It was intoxicating, forbidden, and utterly consuming. One night, after a long session organizing notes and preparing materials for the seminar, we sat close on the couch in her apartment. The room dimly lit, quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "I don't know how we can keep this from him, or even why we shouldn't stop." I felt a shiver run through me, torn between logic and desire. I don't know," I admitted, my voice low. "It feels wrong, but I can't stop." She sighed softly, her fingers tracing patterns on my arm, sending electric shocks straight through me. "Neither can I," she whispered. We shouldn't, but we can't resist either. In that moment, I realized the full extent of what we had done. It wasn't just a fleeting lapse or a simple mistake. It was a choice, a crossing of lines I hadn't imagined I'd ever approach. And yet, here we were, tangled in a secret we both craved, addicted to the thrill of each encounter, aware of the consequences yet unable, or unwilling to resist. I left that night with my mind spinning, the echo of her voice, the warmth of her body, and the memory of her touch seared into me. Every step I took back to my dorm was heavy with anticipation and dread, and I knew that nothing in my life would ever feel the same. We were careful, meticulous, perfect in our timing, yet every moment felt like a daring gamble, and the risk was intoxicating. I kept replaying our encounters in my head, memorizing every glance, every whispered word, every brush of skin, as though the memories themselves were a lifeline in this dangerous game we had begun. And yet, beneath all the excitement, a shadow lingered: guilt, fear, and the nagging question of what this really meant. I had crossed a line I wasn't supposed to, with someone I wasn't supposed to fall for, and now, there was no turning back. I don't know if we're lovers, if we're conspirators, or something else entirely. Every stolen touch, every whispered secret, every heartbeat shared in hiding makes me wonder, what are we now? And as much as I crave her, I can't stop thinking about the consequences waiting just beyond the door. What do you think? Should they keep going, or is this the start of something they'll regret forever? Leave your thoughts below.